Very good evening to you and welcome to Politics 101. David Hines here, of course, with you on Thursday evening. If you're joining us from Guyana, welcome down to Politics 101. If you're coming to us from the wider Caribbean, welcome. I know lots of us are in Barbados, St. Lucia, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Kitts, Nevis, Antigua, of course, the Bahamas, Jamaica. Welcome down to Politics 101. If you're coming to us from the so-called diaspora, meaning if you're in North America or in Europe, welcome down to Politics 101. Good evening to those of you who are in Suriname. We often forget our neighbors there. Lots of our people in Suriname and French Guyana. If you're in St. Martin, welcome. Welcome to Politics 101, the exodus of our people coming across the Middle Passage and coming to the Americas, and certainly our Caribbean is a large family. I don't consider the Caribbean to be the diaspora. I think about the Caribbean diaspora, not so much about the Guyanese diaspora in the Caribbean, because we are all part of the Caribbean family. Welcome down to Politics 101. Thank you all for joining us last evening. And of course, last evening we were talking about that World Bank report that shows 48% of Guyanese workers earning less than 1,100 Guyanese dollars, five and a half US dollars per day. And, we were talking about beef, for example, being $700 per pound. And so if you are earning less than $1,100 a pound of beef, and by the time you buy the greens and rice and so on, you already use up that $1,100 or less that you're earning. Quite chilling. And for a country that has, 19.9% GDP growth, GDP last year, and is slated to grow even more in 2022. The point is, all of the money that has been coming in through oil, where is it going? It's not going to the workers. It's not going to the workers. And all that money that they're sharing away, it still is not making an impact on the lives of the working people. And so that's our Guyana. I was a little boy, and I remember Brother UC bringing Wilfred David. He was then the economic advisor to Prime Minister Burnham. And he came to Buxton. Brother UC bringing him. And the first time as a small boy, I hear somebody say that you can have growth without development. And I remember being mesmerized by that as a 12, 13-year-old. And here I am, almost, 50 years later. We are seeing the truth of that. Growth, big growth without development. Wilfred David, I think he's still in Washington, D.C., Maryland area. I have to try and get in touch with him when I go there to see my family. Wilfred and Peggy David used to be good friends of mine when I lived there. And Wilfred taught at Howard University, where I went. And he's a Belladrum man, Belladrum El Dorado. West Coast Bobis, one of the early advisors to Prime Minister Burnham and the PNC of the 1970s. And tonight, we are going to be talking about GECOM and elections. My guest is Vincent Alexander, one of the commissioners. You would have noticed, those of you, I think the report was carried only in the Stabrook News, reporting 2 days ago that Commissioners Alexander and Desmond Trotman both are saying that they have no confidence in the planned local government election because they feel that certain things have not been put in place for such an election. And Vincent is here this evening to walk us through that position. How did they arrive at that position? What are the things that they felt that ought to have been put in place for a poll? I invited Mr. Trotman, but he's not able to make it this evening. He just lost his wife, and the funeral was on Monday, and it was asking too much. He did agree to come on, but still doing some support. Condolences, of course, to him and his family. So please share the link and let everyone know that Politics 101 is on. And of course, we've been talking here on this program about whether the opposition should participate in the election without a clean voters list. We know that the list has not been cleaned. Now we're shifting the focus from the political parties. Here are the commissioners. These are commissioners who themselves are casting doubt on whether GECOM is in fact ready to hold credible elections. You know, I was listening to some program last night. I was watching a program last night, and the guest, Daniel Siram, he was on the Freddie Kissoon Gildari show. And, you know, they were peppering him, and they were asking him about these anomalies that they found at GECOM, and they did the recount when during the 5 months. And one of them, I think, might have been Gildari, asking Siram if any of the observers saw or spoke of any of the anomalies. And I think Siram passed in the question, and I was screaming, CARICOM, CARICOM, CARICOM. A lot of people, for good reason, blasted the CARICOM team. You know, they came in obviously with an agenda. But a lot of the complaints of the opposition and the opposition commissioners were in fact the CARICOM team, in fact, concurred with a lot of those observations. You know, I took out my copy of the CARICOM report. I didn't get to go back to it. But the CARICOM conclusion that despite what they saw as the problems at GECOM, that the PPP won the elections. That's what a lot of us had problems with. But in fact, a lot of the complaints, a lot of the issues, a lot of the justification for a review by GECOM is in that report. Anyway, welcome to Politics 101. I am not the expert on GECOM. Vincent Alexander is the expert in GECOM, and I got Vincent to forego a cultural activity to come here tonight to talk with us about this issue. Vincent, good evening, my brother.
Good evening, David. And to the
And I
viewer.
know you're traveling, and thanks for taking some time out. I know you're at a conference, right?
That's correct.
Right, and taking some time out to speak to us. I want us to talk about the report in the Stabrook News that you and Commissioner Desmond Trotman, I didn't see the report didn't say the third opposition commissioner, Mr. Charles Corbin, was part of your assessment there. But certainly you and Mr. Desmond Trotman are casting some doubt on whether, in fact, the upcoming polls, the local government polls by GECOM, is one that you can support given the fact that certain things have not been put in place. But before we get there, let's go back to that GECOM report. Am I correct in my assessment of the GECOM report? Not GECOM, CARICOM, the CARICOM Observers Report.
Yes, you are in fact correct. My focus on that report, however, is one omission. And that omission has to do with the fact that during the period that the observer team was in Guyana, GECOM had already received information from the chief immigration officer that there were many persons whose names were ticked off as having voted, who were in fact not in the country at the time. And what raised the eyebrows was the fact that though we had that information in our possession, it was not made available to the CARICOM team or to any team. So that in fact the CARICOM team mentions quite the opposite. They said that they did not see such information. And so that's a serious omission, I think, in that report. Though the report in the main carried comments on most of the anomalies that occurred, and like many other reports, concluded that there was a need for attention to be paid to the voters list. The voters list was a matter of concern in terms of GECOM being able to deliver an election that was beyond controversy.
Thank you very much for that observation, because that's a very important observation, and it continues to be one of the areas that is being evaded by those who are supporting the government, and even some people who call themselves independent, pouring cold water, if you will, on the report coming out of the RECOM. Vincent, I know that you played a very important role in helping to craft Order 60. And I am disappointed that a lot of people, well-meaning people, are not paying attention or have not been paying attention to what Order 60 intended to do. Refresh our memory, if you will, about what Order 60 intended to do.
Well, Order 60 provided for a recount. In the circumstance where the law gave GECOM the authority for the removal of difficulties to issue an order that would seek to overcome the difficulties confronted. And so we were confronted with the difficulties in relation to claims that Mingo had produced reports and results that were not accurate, did not reflect the ballots cast. And so a decision was taken to do a overall recount. When that decision was taken, we also had a situation where, at least in two other regions, Region 6 and Region 3, I think it was, that recounts had been called for as well. So we decided to do an overall recount. But we did not issue an order that simply said to recount the ballots, which is what occurs when there is a recount that is provided within 48 hours of the results of a district. The order that we crafted catered for what may be seen as a forensic audit of the elections. And so, beyond merely counting the ballots, the order provided for a determination of all that was required in terms of the conclusion of the process. That is, when people go to vote, there is a pink slip in the possession of the returning officer, the presiding officer, sorry. And on that slip, the names of the voters are marked off. So you can do a control between the number of names marked off, for example, the number of ballots cast. So we were supposed to be checking all of those documents, which are documents which are to be returned to GECOM at the end of the election. So you have the statement of poll, which is returned. You have all of the unused ballots, which are returned. You have the voters list with the names crossed off, which were returned. And so the audit provided for all of that. And the audit went on beyond saying that we're doing a mere recount, providing for all of those things to be taken into consideration in terms of what would finally be done after the recount would have been concluded. So it was a forensic audit, and all of these matters, other than merely recounting the ballots, were to be taken into consideration. The fact of the matter is that during the course of the recount, many matters, many things were discovered that are of grave concern, were of grave concern then, and are still of grave concern, that brought into dispute the credibility of the elections. And in the instance of the East Coast in particular, not only did the revelations of what was documented create concern, but the absence of the required documents was also of concern. We could not make the same kinds of determinations as to what occurred on the East Coast because all of the documents went missing. And so, whilst in other places we were able to say, here is evidence that people who were out of the country were voted for, as has since been verified by the chief immigration officer, we could not do that in Region 4, District 4, and more particularly on the East Coast. Now that is of tremendous interest for a number of reasons. First of all, during the course of the day, election day, E-Day, there were accusations that there were persons who were sharing out ID cards. And this was in the public domain. The accusation was in the public domain. So you had that occurring in the said area where subsequently we could not find the documents. I myself made an observation in Region District 4 on the East Coast. I covered the entire area of the East Coast up to Virginia, down at the back of Mahaica. And the observation I made on the East Coast was that there were a large number of persons who were voting using affidavits. Now, what's the affidavit? Affidavit is a document used to attest to someone being the person whose name is on the list, if that person does not have an ID card. And so I noted a irregular number of persons who were voting by affidavit. In fact, when I inquired at one station after the people complained that the process was slow, what the presiding officer said to me that the process is going to be slow if you have such a large number of people voting with affidavit. So here you had an area where we couldn't find the documentation, and it's the same area in which people voted with affidavits, and those documents, all of those documents went missing, and the said area was the area in which, on the day in question, there was the accusation that ID cards were being shared out. So that when I saw all that occurred, and the fact that 47 boxes were affected in terms of the documentation, and that those 47 boxes represented about 14,000 votes, and that the difference between the PPPC and the opposition parties was a mere 7,000 votes. I came to the conclusion that one could not use that ballot count to declare a result, and made a specific recommendation, which has been documented, and it's a document in circulation called the case for a non-declaration. And my proposition at that time was that you cannot disenfranchise people, and there would have been people in that area who would have voted, and therefore you can't simply discard their votes and disenfranchise them. But that since there was concerns, legitimate concerns about ballots in that area, and what should have been done is that we should have held a by-election in that area.
Yeah.
So you put aside all of those ballots, hold a by-election to ensure that the persons who did cast votes were not disenfranchised in any way, and that the system did not produce a false result. And so have a by-election, and therefore after the by-election take that result into the overall results to make a determination. That was not done. And it's around that question that the whole issue of valid votes occurred. It's around that question that the whole issue with the chief elections officer giving his own interpretation to what a valid vote was, and coming up with results that sought to exclude votes which he thought were not valid. I didn't agree with his approach. I thought the approach that I just mentioned was a far better approach, because it meant you nullified all of the questionable ballots, but provided the voters in that area with an opportunity to vote through a by-election, and therefore to get a true result rather than to take a judgmental position on the matter. But that did not carry. And so although the order provided for us to investigate, to determine what had occurred other than merely recounting, when it came to the declaration of the results, all of the information other than the recount numbers was put aside under an argument, which continues to be an argument up to today, and I'll say more about that later, that all of those matters were matters for a petition. So nobody queried that they were matters of concern at that time. Even the PPP weren't querying them. They started querying after the results were announced. Nobody queried that. The argument was, look, those matters are matters for a petition. I do not share that view. It is not normal for us to have an order like the one we had, Order 60. And therefore, in the circumstance of an Order 60, I felt that one could not restrict the judgment of GECOM to provisions which said that if there were issues that arose after account, that those issues were for petition. Because in my humble opinion, the issues did not arise after a recount, they arose during the course of a recount. And I think that if the judgment was based on a historical contextual approach rather than a literary approach to the interpretation of the law, that it could well have been judgment which says that those things should have been taken into consideration. Unfortunately, that decision was not appealed, and therefore, in Guyana, we still do not have a final position on the question as to whether Order 60 should have been obeyed differently. We have a judgment, yes, but we don't have a final legal position because the judgment was not contested, and not having been contested, it has not gone to the highest court where, in fact, our laws are determined. And so we have that situation today where the question of those matters is still, in many regards, before the court, and in many other regards, still of concern to those of us who are involved in the administration of our electoral system.
Vincent Alexander here, setting the stage for us to discuss the position taken by himself and brother Commissioner Desmond Trotman. According to the Stabroek News headline, Alexander Trotman and Trotman withholding support for local government polls. Before we go directly to that, let's continue with some more context. Vincent, you're right, because the justice threw out the second petition, but it has not been heard in the appeal court. In fact, just this past week, we learned that the written judgment that the Court of Appeal they were waiting on in order to hear the appeal, they're now in possession of that written judgment by the Chief Justice. So the jury's still out on Order 60 as it relates to our court, right?
That's correct.
That's correct. Vincent, one more thing I want you to explain, because it's something that a lot of people are ignoring. There continues to be this chorus on the part of the opposition, the PPP and its supporters, with asking where are the statements of poll by the statements of poll that are in the possession of the coalition. And you have pointed out that the elections were not determined by statements of poll, but by statements of recount. Explain.
That's correct. Well, there are two things about that. First of all, to put it very crudely, where are the statements of poll in the possession of the opposition is nobody's business. Those statements are provided to parties for their own internal determination, and the official statements are with GECOM. And those official statements, as I understand it, are now in the possession of the court. And so anybody who wants to focus on where Norton has his statements of poll, they're trying to create an issue that doesn't exist. Norton's statements of poll are not the source of any determination at this point in time. As you correctly said, the results were based on the statements from the count on one hand, and on the other hand, the original statements are in the possession of the court. So there is no missing document called statements of poll that people have to be asking Norton for. The court has them. The PPP has them. All the parties who are involved have them. So why is this big cry about Norton's statements of poll? The matters that Norton's has sought to contest, or the APNU AFC, are before the court, and the determination of those matters will be made by the court. Not only are they before the court, but my understanding is that in relation to charges brought against GECOM officials, those statements are also, those are the statements which are with the court. So the court has those statements, and at the appropriate time, hopefully that comes, we will have a determination of those matters. And I just want to make a comment on the side. I heard the PPPC complaining that these persons have been brought before the court and the court is slothful. The public should know that much of the slothfulness of the court has nothing to do with the court itself. It has to do in the first instance with the persons who brought the charges. They brought charges and were not prepared to proceed with the matters before the magistrate. One would believe that you bring in charges, that you have the evidence. They asked for time. And having asked for time, when the magistrate decided that they would go ahead, they then brought action, requesting that the matters not be heard in one manner and be heard in another manner. That is the difference between being heard indictively and being heard summarily. And that matter, the magistrate ruled on, and they have since appealed that matter, and therefore they are solely responsible for the delays from the very inception in terms of not being ready to proceed to prosecute the case. And having made all of these appeals, they're the ones who are holding up the process. And in the meantime, whilst people are should be innocent until proven guilty, the propaganda machinery is out there condemning and deeming people who have not been tried in a court of laws yet to be guilty, and people who have suffered the consequences of their thoughts of guilt by virtue of having their contracts terminated. These are things that we should be very, very conscious and very, very much aware of. Another point I want to make, you have mentioned that the Starbuck News carried an article in relation to the position of myself and Commissioner Trotman. The fact of the matter is that Kaishu News has since carried an article as well, and the Guyana Standard, an online newspaper, has also carried that article. Of course, you wouldn't get that in other such paper.
Right.
But it's important to note that while myself and Commissioner Trotman took a position on the matter, that Commissioner Corbin was engaged in contesting the plan for the elections. As we speak here tonight, we do not have a plan that has been absolutely approved. We have a plan that has gone through 9 iterations. And in every instance, it is the efforts of Commissioner Corbin to identify faults and flaws in the plan that has led to another iteration, which a certain commissioner sought to say was an attempt by him, Commissioner Corbin, to delay the elections. But the fact of the matter is that he has raised valid concerns about the plan, and it's out of frustration in some regards that even as he continued to raise those concerns, that myself and Commissioner Trotman took a position, because we felt that separate and apart from those concerns which he continued to raise, that there were other matters that didn't lend to a process that could be free, fair, and compliant. A major matter which Commissioner Corbin is still contesting is the manner of the conduct of claims and objections. We are having local government elections. local government elections, which means that people have to be resident in the local area to cast their vote. And so, whilst the argument is that in terms of the national list, residency is not pertinent, it is undoubtedly and legally pertinent in local government elections. So the issue of residency is an issue for local government elections. Now, when we do claims and objections, the intention of claims and objections in particular, is to take off of the list names of persons who are not eligible to vote because they may have died or for some other reason that the law provides for. In the case of local government elections, the provision of residency as a requirement makes it possible to object to persons whose names are in the National Register of Registrants and whose names will remain there, persons whose names are in the OLE, the official list of electors, and the names will remain there, to have their names taken off of the list for the specific local government area and or a constituency in that area if they are not residing in that area. Such persons should have themselves made claims to be on the list of in the area where they reside. And objections can be made to have such persons taken off of the list when it comes down to a list that is specific to a local government area or a constituency in a local government area. But the manner in which we conducted the claims and objections did not advise the public that objections would be entertained for persons who are in the country, who are legitimately on the preliminary list, the revised list, the final list, but who are not located on the list in the area where they reside. And so we now have a list in which there are many persons who do not reside in local areas, but they are listed there and may return on the day in question to cast a vote. So once again, we are going down the road where we have not properly prepared our list, and therefore one can well argue that an election cannot be free, an election cannot be fair, an election cannot be compliant if you have a flawed list. And being free, fair, and compliant are provisions of the Constitution. GECOM has an obligation to ensure that we have free, fair, and compliant elections, and not to have conducted claims and objections in a manner required for local government elections brings into question GECOM fulfilling its obligation for free, fair, and compliant elections. And Commissioner Corbyn, as we left the last meeting, was still arguing that case, and the CEO undertook for what may have well been the 10th time to review what was being done. Of course, we know what the likely outcome of that will be, because there are commissioners who have not supported the contention, which is in keeping with the Constitution, and therefore, notwithstanding the rightness of the argument of Commissioner Corbyn, a decision may still be made to proceed in a manner that's not right. And that is part of the reason that led to the frustration of myself and Commissioner Trotman and our declaration, which was based not only on that matter, but based on other issues that would have affected GECOM's capacity to produce a free, fair, and compliant election. And so,
go ahead.
What are those other matters?
Go right ahead.
First of all, we've had an election 2020. And there's been a lot of controversy surrounding those elections, and I've referred to some of the things already that have become very apparent from the recount. Very apparent from the recount. Even before the elections, there was a call for a clean list. The events during the course of the elections justified a call for the clean list. The events during the elections in terms of people who were not eligible to vote, votes being cast for them, points to the fact that the list not having been cleansed facilitated wrongdoing. In the normal course of any exercise, any project, at the end of the project, one would do an evaluation to determine the effectiveness and the efficacy, the efficiency of the project. GECOM has refused by a majority vote to do so and has sought to use the argument that the matters which may arise are matters for the court. My understanding of the Constitution is that the court has jurisdiction over contestation of the results. The court has not removed from GECOM its jurisdiction to evaluate its processes and based on the evaluation to take corrective action. But GECOM has refused to do such an evaluation and therefore has not put itself in a position to determine what flaws we may have in our operations and to plug those flaws so that it gets closer to its constitutional mandate of producing a free, fair, and compliant election. And so that's our first major concern. And the concern is not merely a concern, it is a fact that these issues have arisen, and therefore we should seek to understand how could they have arisen, not who caused them, not who's culpable. That's a matter for the court, but how they could have arisen. And what can GECOM do to plug the gaps? And GECOM has refused to do that. We have gone on a bit further to argue that in the circumstance of a judgment which says we could not take names off of the National Register of Registrants, and as a consequence couldn't take names off of the electoral roll, but knowing evidentially and factually that there are names there of persons who would have died overseas in particular, locally as well as persons who are overseas and for whom votes were cast at the last elections, that we could introduce a system at the place of poll. Lots of people are confused when we talk about the electronic voting and all of that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking merely about a system at the place of poll where persons are allowed to vote after it would have been determined that they are in fact the persons on the list by virtue of a fingerprint identity. Because it is the absence of that that could have allowed people through the system on the last occasion. So we said, look, let's have a biometric system that allows when somebody turns up to vote, that person has this fingerprint, which fingerprints are unique to individuals, checked electronically, and if the person passes the test, the person is allowed to go through, cast the vote. If the person doesn't pass the test, then obviously on that scientific basis, that's not the person whose name is listed. And GECOM has refused to deal with this matter in an appropriate manner. What they said to us, those of us who brought the motion, is that they need some feasibility study and all of that, and have proceeded to continue the preparation for local government elections, and that matter is on the back burner. We have gone further in terms of that overall system and suggested that in the course of the present RUPA amendments being proposed, that be one of the propositions, that RUPA provides for the use of biometric systems. That motion for 2 months now has not been discussed, but the process of finalizing the amendments is ongoing. And so for us, clearly, there are issues in relation to GECOM's state of preparedness for a free, fair, and compliant election. And to add to that, as I just mentioned, we have the RUPA situation, where the government is proceeding with amendments that, according to the Attorney General, will take effect before the elections. But we are not proceeding on the basis of those amendments. Now, I don't know what they're going to be. And therefore, it seems to me that it's not proper to have amendments come into play when we are down the road in terms of our preparations, because we don't know what kind of collisions or what kind of preparation would be required for those amendments. So it's against that background that we, who in principle believe there should be local government elections, and I need to emphasize that because I'm quite sure the propaganda machine will say we don't want to have elections. We who are in principle in agreement with elections have a difficulty with proceeding in the manner in which we are proceeding because of the GECOM's errant behavior in terms of addressing issues that should be addressed to prepare properly for an election.
Vincent Alexander, they're walking us through the reasons that he and his brother commissioners are skeptical about the upcoming local government election. They are threatening or have declared that they will withhold their support for such election. I think this goes to the heart of the democratic process, because here you have commissioners who are charged with overseeing the process, and they are saying upfront that these elections do not meet the test of constitutional. They do not pass the constitutional test. You heard Brother Vincent there speaking about what the Constitution requires GECOM to do, and that the outcome of the process must be elections in which all stakeholders have confidence in. And so it is, of course, worrying that commissioners who are sitting around the table, given what we have learned from the last election, nobody talks more about the 5 months. And Vincent likes to say it's not 5 months, right? But nobody talks about that period more than PPP and its parrots, its acolytes. And yet here our commissioners are saying, look, we have had this experience. We have seen what happened in the last election. We have the recount and the anomalies. And here we are going into another election. You haven't corrected those things. It would seem to me that if the PPP is saying that the elections there was an attempt to rig the elections and so on, you would want at the level of GECOM to correct what gave rise to those things. But the PPP wants to correct it with these amendments We don't know what they are. And if you follow what the AG is saying, these amendments are meant more to punish people rather than to correct the architecture, repair the architecture of GECOM. You see, this double standard is what bothers me. Vincent said early on that, look, he proposed that you should have a by-election in the areas where they saw all these anomalies. The PPP disagreed. But it was the same PPP that was saying, don't count the votes in the other boxes, in the other regions. Just recount Region 4, which in effect it has the same effect of a by-election. Yet when Alexander says by-election, they don't agree with it. Double standards. Vincent, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, indeed, we don't see persons being guided by principles. We see persons being guided by interest. And if one reviews carefully what occurred on the East Coast, one cannot but conclude that the PPP had an interest in not having a by-election. They had an interest when we called for review in not being able to determine what occurred in Region 4, where those 47 boxes could not show up the documents. All that they're doing is akin to an interest in not correcting the flaws, and therefore an interest that suggests that they are themselves beneficiaries of the flaws and or the wrongdoing that occurred in District 4 and on the East Coast in particular. Our concern is about the system at large, and so let's do the review and let's see what's wrong with our systems, what's wrong with our operations. Let's correct those, and let's produce a free and fair and compliant election. But we have all sorts of objections. We have Mr. Jaglio out there saying that if you use biometrics, that you will have people being disenfranchised, right? You have Gunraj in the commission saying that we don't object to biometrics, but we're not there yet. And so all sorts of conflicting dispositions, but the core of those dispositions add up to let's not do it. Let's not do it. And let's not do it provides an environment in which the interests of those who don't want it done may be served.
Yeah. So Vincent, you all have taken a stand, and Politics 101 want to support your stand, because I think our interests, those of us who are partisan, we do have partisan interests. But there must be a point in which your partisan interest must be guided by the overall interest, and that is the interest in free and transparent elections. And what 2020 has taught me is that we have been delaying all the time, repairing our electoral machine. And the big lesson of those months, 5 months or 3 months or whatever, is that everything came crashing down. For me, it's not about the rigging or alleged rigging. It's about how the entire process was found wanting. And one party got into power as a result of a flawed process, starting with the voters list. And so therefore, that party, as Vincent has been saying, seems not interested in correcting the process. By their own logic, we can conclude that they are interested in perpetuating and continuing the very thing that they're complaining about, that elections were rigged. Whereas here are commissioners who are saying, let's do a review and see where we went wrong and correct this problem. And it is being resisted. Vincent, what next?
Well, I think as commissioners, we have done and are doing what is required of us. These matters undoubtedly require political action, requires involvement of the people whose rights are being affected. And therefore, for me, this matter has to be left to the politicians, the parties, and more particularly to the people at large. But the people at large have got to be educated, and that's a role people like myself have to play, to bring factual information to the people at large, for them to make a determination as to where they stand on these matters, and for them to do what people normally do in these circumstances, ensure that their voices are heard and that things that ought to be corrected are corrected. So it's in the hands of the political parties, it's in the hands of the people, and they will have to take responsibility for what happens hereafter. We would have had to take responsibility if we did not bring it to their attention, and we have done so, and ball is in their court.
The ball is in their court. Vincent Alexander, opposition appointed commissioner. And notice I said opposition appointed commissioners, not opposition commissioners. Because once they've been appointed, they then become commissioners of GECOM. They then become national commissioners. All right? We sometimes say the government commissioner and the opposition commissioner. And I think that is somewhat flawed. Maybe the PPP commissioners are operating as an extension of Freedom House. And I can tell you from my little dealings with the opposition and from my proximity from time to time, I know for a fact that those commissioners do not take instructions from the opposition. And I think Vincent, years back when some people were calling for him to be removed, he made it very clear that his position was a constitutional position. And I think that that is the way to go if we are going to clean up the electoral process and produce free and fair elections. Vincent, I can't let you go without asking you what's happening at IPADG in relation to the subvention.
Well, we have had absolutely no word from the government. The bureaucrats, when asked, there are no answers. The ministers who were written to, both the minister, senior minister of finance in the office of the president and the minister for culture, youth and sports, both were written to. We have not received any response from either of those ministers, and we have not received the subvention for October nor the subvention for November. So that's where we stand. We have not given up on our mandate. We are still operating with the resources at our disposal, the human resources in particular, and we are carefully examining the matter of the subvention, both in terms of the short term and the long term, and at the appropriate time, we'll make public our disposition and course of action in that regard.
Vincent Alexander there updating us on the situation with IPADG, which has not received the subvention. And if my understanding serves me right, that subvention was okayed by the National Assembly, right, Vincent?
The appropriation of the Parliament.
Yes, Parliament. Yes, because it was part of a policy and not just giving money to a group. It's a policy decision. Vincent, anything that you want to leave us before we go?
Well, I would say that the citizens have to be far more conscious, far more vigilant, and far more responsive to the environment in which we are existing, so as to ensure that their rights are secured, so as to ensure as citizens they're treated fairly, and that elections is critical in that regard, and therefore should be on the front burner, you know, of the citizens at this point in time, since they've been called for March, and since there are serious problems with the conduct of those elections, then there should be thought and serious response from the citizens in that regard.
Thank you, Vincent, and for taking time away from the proceedings there at your conference that you're attending to bring us up to date so that we have the kind of information to make decisions. And in the not too distant future, we'll have you back and the Ipadaji people to talk about what's happening there at Ipadaji. Thank you again for coming on to Politics 101.
Thank you very much. We look forward to the Ipadaji opportunity.
Thank you. And there you have it, Vincent Alexander, as usual, being very, very, very detailed in terms of his explanation. And that is why, it's when you're doing interviews, it's your dream when you interview people who know what they are talking about. Not only that Vincent knows what's happening there at GECOM, but he has an overall understanding of elections and the role of election in the larger politics of our country. The challenge that he has given us there is that this matter has now gone beyond the commissioners. It is for our political leaders and our people to take what the commissioners have given us and to take a stand. To take a stand. We've got to take a strong stand against this attempt to carry on with an election that would be clearly compromised. It is obvious that the PPP is not interested in fairness. It is obvious that they are not interested in justice. And unfortunately or fortunately, those on our side of the political aisle are left with the burden of ensuring that GECOM carries out its mandate. And so, a call to action. The local government election is not a done deal. It's an opportunity for a call to action. We'll talk more about that next week. Have yourselves a good weekend, and I'll see you here on Monday. We're going to have a special edition on Monday next week, so look out for us on Monday. In the meantime, stay good, keep up the struggle, keep up our spirits, and ensure that we continue to be witnesses on our own behalf, because we are all we have. We are all we have. Professor Rex Nettleford never tired of reminding us we are all we have.